talk about the critical social justice work of faith-based organizations during this time of incredible need and beyond. I'm going to start by introducing our participants. We'll start with Rabbi Miriam Terlinchamp. Rabbi Miriam Terlinchamp serves as the spiritual leader of Temple Sholom in Cincinnati, Ohio. She's the founder of Just Love, a multi-faith movement for activists, is the immediate past president of the Amos Project, writes for the Cincinnati Enquirer newspaper editorial board, and is a Rabbis Without Borders fellow. Welcome, Rabbi. We're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
We're also joined by the Reverend Winnie Varghese, who is a priest on the strategy clergy team at Trinity Church Wall Street in New York City, where she has been for the last 5 years. Before starting her ministry at Trinity, she served as the rector of St. Mark's in the Bowery and was the Episcopal chaplain at Columbia University. She is also a prolific writer on the relationship between communities of faith and the larger community as a blogger for Patheos, author of the book Church Meets World, editor of What We Shall Become, and many, many more. Winnie, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we're happy to be joined by Pastor Mike McBride, Pastor Mike, who is joining us from the Bay Area out in California. He's a native of San Francisco and has been in active ministry for over 20 years. He founded the Way Christian Center in West Berkeley, where he presently serves as the lead pastor. And he's also the director of the Live Free campaign with Faith in Action, a campaign led by hundreds of faith congregations throughout the United States that's committed to addressing gun violence and mass incarceration of young people of color. For each of these three incredible people, I have barely begun to scratch the surface. Pastor Mike, we're glad you're here with us as well. And just really appreciate you all taking the time in what are very, very busy schedules. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right in for our discussion today. For those watching, we're going to start the conversation among this group and have a chance to talk a little bit in a very informal way. But we encourage you all to start putting questions into the chat alongside your screen because we'll have an opportunity for some discussion and questions and answers from the audience a little bit later on in the program. So with that, we will just jump right into the conversation. So the recent weeks and months have been times of just incredible fear, suffering, loneliness, even death for people around the country and throughout the world. In times such as these, many people instinctively reach to their faith and to their faith institutions to give them support, help them get through, even help them heal. The coronavirus pandemic has been no exception to this instinct, but the rules have changed dramatically in this moment. We're going to talk today about the role and work of communities of faith in this moment and what the future holds. So let's start at the beginning. The understanding of what this pandemic would mean for all of us probably sank in at different times for each of you. Interestingly, here in Washington, D.C., the faith community seemed at the center from the start because our patient zero was actually the priest of a large congregation here in D.C. And so the presence of COVID-19 within congregations was something that people felt very immediately and very concretely. So tell us about your realization that change was coming. How did you prepare? What was in your minds as you thought about how to respond to your congregation's needs and the community's needs for guidance and support in this moment? Rabbi, do you want to get started?
Sure. I think that it's difficult to say, how do you prepare for a future you can't imagine? And so there are some things that we were doing, but I wouldn't say that they were prescient or anything, that we knew that this exactly was coming. I have family in Washington State. And so as I was watching that, I made sure that we had enough of all the things that you need in the congregation to keep everyone safe. We made sure that everyone had devices that needed access to Wi-Fi would have it, those kinds of things. But I don't think that anything truly could have prepared me for the amount of loss that we were going to experience. Right now, in the last 7 weeks, we've had the same amount of deaths in our community as we would have in an entire year. And just to hold that the circumference of pain and loss is so large that there was no real way to do that. So we were set up technologically, we were set up with all the access things, we were set up with hygiene. We had no idea what it would mean for so many people to be enduring what they're enduring. So I'd say that we were prepared well, but I'm not sure that we really knew what was coming and what it would be like to be in this moment.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, that preparation is everything from the logistics of Wi-Fi to these really incredibly huge and large questions and grief that people are dealing with. Pastor Mike, tell us how your preparation unfolded. You were preparing locally and also began preparing nationally.
Yeah, locally, immediately we had to turn our attention mostly pastorally into assessing the impact of COVID, particularly those who we believed were highest at risk for being affected. We did an internal survey of our congregation and realized we had hundreds of congregation members spread in 46 cities in the Bay Area, if you can imagine that. And we weren't as in touch with all of them as we had imagined. So we launched an internal survey to just track with folks how many of them had underlying health conditions. And we got 35% back of all of those who took the survey identified themselves as having underlying health conditions in our congregation. So we had to set up a number of triage responses from our staff teams to make sure regionally we were covering folks. And then nationally, we were immediately being informed about the lack of personal protective equipment for our frontline workers outside of doctors and nurses, whether they were street outreach workers still being deemed essential workers, thankfully by our local municipalities, but they didn't have masks, they didn't have sanitizer. Then we heard horror stories inside the jails and the prisons, and they certainly weren't being given masks or sanitizer. And we then got informed by some of our national partners who work in the hospital supply chain conversations at the highest level that masks and PPE were not being extended to people in jails, prisons, and even on the ground. And so we launched the Mask for the People as an effort to try to at least create a supply chain for the people, by the people, that could bring some mask and sanitizer into Black and brown, urban and rural communities, into carceral institutions, and help our elderly and our frontline workers have access to basic life-saving equipment that can at least slow down the virus. So it's been both a pastoral response, both locally and nationally, through all of our many networks. And it's sad that we have to resort to charity to fulfill what we all believe our tax dollars and our governmental system should be fulfilling and providing for us. But in times of crisis, usually faith communities are often called to fill in the gap.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Winnie, I'll turn to you because I know you at Trinity, there's an enormous role that's played as in faith leadership, but also in the philanthropic space. What were you all thinking and planning as this became more and more evident?
Here in New York, the messaging wasn't quite clear. So the first, I remember a week where on Tuesday we weren't sure how. We were just starting to talk about how to support staff who decide that it's too dangerous to come to work because of their household or who's in their household or their own underlying conditions. And by Thursday, we were closing, and we're really well connected, and it wasn't clear in that week what exactly we should do. And we decided the priest should come to church, and we have a large staff, so we're also very concerned about anyone taking a risk they shouldn't take, and not really understanding what the risks were. There was really different information in our city and in the state about what was dangerous. And so that first Sunday, all the priests came to church, and looking back, what a odd choice that we made, but we didn't know what was happening. So you could take all of your clergy and put them in a room together and do a service. That makes sense. And it did at the time. And the reason I say that is that we all kind of made this decision together. And of course, that's what you do. You show up for your people. And if your people, and we told everyone to stay home so that they were safe, but we would show up, not recognizing that it's a different kind of danger than we're used to, that we, and then soon found out like everyone that next week who was already sick. I was the preacher at the conference where the priest in Washington got sick, and then all the other sicknesses
right.
rolled out a couple of weeks later. And so many of our colleagues were sick, and everyone's recovered, but we were all in a conference together. So also the web of our networks and how we're influenced, how we influence one another became so clear, and who got sick and where in our church, and quickly. And then that next Sunday, we had been home for a week. The priests had gone to stand outside we have two different buildings, just in case people had come by and didn't know that the services weren't on, or if they needed anything. And one woman walked by St. Paul's while I was there with some colleagues, who said she didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't really use a landline, didn't have any way to connect to any of the ways that we had set up to be connected. And we run extensive outreach programs and have all kinds of folks in our community, and realized how many actually had no idea what was happening. So we, in a very old-fashioned way, our phone trees are back up. We have a lot of new groups that now meet on Zoom. All our elderly parishioners are being contacted regularly. And we actually have this really vibrant community that all is happening on our screens right now. And the philanthropy side, that team is working so hard in grants and mission investing, because we've just decided we have to move a lot of money very quickly into the city of New York for support here in the city, because as Pastor Mike has said, we are not equipped at all. We were not equipped as we should have been. So we got in as fast as we could. And then we have a focus on homelessness and housing and on criminal justice reform. And this is a moment in which so many people are horribly vulnerable, and it's an opportunity to do what we should have done all along in terms of who should be freed and what should be available in housing in New York. So we're pushing as hard as we can right now and spending to do that as well.
Yeah, it is incredible when you sort of think back over this past couple of months and realize just how incredibly compressed, and you can remember those snapshots of what I was thinking on that day 7 weeks ago, and from where we sit right now, it's just mind-boggling to think how unprepared we were for what was going to be coming. I want to follow up on what you were just mentioning, and Pastor Mike, you were mentioning as well. I mean, this is a moment that, as we know, has really laid bare, even more than before, if it's possible, the incredible disparities in the ways in which communities of color, people who are incarcerated, people who live in poverty, the disparate impact of this allegedly, unbiased virus strain is really astounding, and is something that we've seen faith communities stepping into the breach on, many of them the same faith communities that have been bearing witness to this and have been really working to try to address these problems for a long time. What's happening now? What's the opportunity here? What do you see happening, changing? What are the needs? What do folks think about sort of where this may go in the near term and maybe even in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I just know that as the old adage says, when America gets a cold, Black America gets the flu, and in this case, we've certainly been disproportionately killed and forever injured by this virus. I think that for us, we have to continue to figure out how do we build supply chains of not just materials, but accurate information and facts that do not depend on this president or even some local mayors, state governors, and other elected leaders. Unfortunately, in this moment, particularly Christians seem to be very vulnerable to conspiracy theories. I mean, I've just found so many folks who are sharing videos about, this virus being a ploy to get folks to take a vaccine, and, the 666 mark of the beast. I have people that haven't been to church and they were in Sunday school, and it seemed like the only thing they can remember is the mark of the beast and the Antichrist. I was like, do you remember anything about Jesus? I don't know. So yeah, I think that it's terribly challenging to know that we just can't depend on people that are supposed to be tasked with providing information This is in many respects an information crisis of epic proportions. And so when there is not information, people are then left to fill in gaps, and then their fear and irrationality takes over. And so for us, I do believe we have to continue to call out the disproportionality of the lack of healthcare, both preventive and responsive, particularly in our southern and Midwestern states where we have states led by conservative, Republican-leaning administrations, and they've denied access to Obamacare or healthcare, and so states literally don't have the funding or the hospitals or the beds or the equipment for the influx of patients that we know have come and are to come. So there's so many responses. I would just continue to compel and beckon us to keep advocating with a racial equity lens. That in this moment, it appears that since the disproportionate impact of this virus will be Black and brown people, that elected officials seem to be okay with easing the restrictions and cutting corners. It's a terrible crisis that will have racial implications in the short and long term, and all of us as people of faith and goodwill must continue to call that out, even while we attend to the ways in which this virus impacts us directly in our own communities, in our own contexts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it really is your point about the crisis of information and the ways in which we are sort of hampered at every turn, and put in the position of I think, each individual is trying to figure out what they know and what they don't know, but also, entire cities, entire faith networks, all of that, we're all in this position. Rabbi Miriam, do you want to jump in? I know you all have been thinking about these issues as well with your work. Your community, your congregation is very focused on issues of social justice and has been for a long time. How is this playing out in that work that you're doing there in Ohio?
Well, I'm inspired listening to my colleagues and what they're doing. I will say that being in Ohio, it's complicated right now because we have a governor who I didn't vote for and wouldn't have even thought of voting for, and now he's really leading amazingly with one hand, and on the other hand, cutting all kinds of benefits to schools and healthcare, not tapping into rainy day funds, and we're seeing this protest culture. I think, in the past I would have known what to do. If someone's body is on the line, then you put your body on the line with them, and that's what allyship looked like, and that's how you raise your voice, and that's how you change things, and you can't do it that way anymore. And so what does it mean to speak out and change, and how do you sort of influence positions of power? They're not answering the calls quite the same way they would have before, and also I think knowing whose side you're on in terms of, it's not just party line anymore, and it's specifically not party line here in the Midwest. And we're seeing, it's not the same thing, but we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism come forward. And so people in our community are responding with fear, just like Pastor Mike was saying. Like, as soon as something is tapping into that zone, your reptilian brain is going back and saying, I'm not just scared of this flu, I'm also scared of being attacked for speaking up for others. Our focus in the last couple of years has been specifically around immigration and sanctuary congregations. And it's strange, we do have a family we're supporting right now, and it went from being very active, very hands-on with the family to primarily financial, and that feels strange to pull back in that way. I just I feel like we're in this place of great despair and fear, and we're also being asked to dream at the same time, and it feels really hard to dream while you're in that dark place. And that might just be naive. Maybe that's like how all justice work happens. You're always in a pit and you're always dreaming at the same time, and you're burying and you're building. And yet it feels fresh to me, even though it's not fresh to these justice issues at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting the ways in which the inability to physically be together has so much more impact than than I think we realize that it would. And, every natural instinct that is to go to people and to be with them and to stand beside them and to serve them and to, come in every way is at best hampered and is in some cases really, cut off or even dangerous. Winnie, in the aftermath of 9/11, Trinity Church Wall Street, and in particular Trinity St. Paul's Chapel, which is right across the street there from the World Trade Center site, became a support center for relief and recovery workers and volunteers. And people could come and have their physical needs met, food, water, rest, and also their spiritual needs with clergy and counselors and therapists. That physical space was available as a support for people in a moment of incredible despair and fear for months. And that's exactly the thing that we can't do in this moment. Are there lessons learned from that experience that Trinity is able to draw on in this moment of fear and despair? Or talk about what that's like.
I wasn't at Trinity when that happened, but I was, but a lot of my friends were here, and I remember hearing a lot about it. And Trinity at the time, like everything downtown was closed because you couldn't be open. Sort of like when Sandy happened, right? Everything just shut down. And the reason St. Paul's was used in the way that it was is because it was right there. It was a moment of Trinity doing the thing that only Trinity could do, and there was no plan. There wasn't a white paper on how we were going to use our space. They literally opened the doors and the ministry came to it, right? People just used the space and quite powerfully for a long time. I think it's one of the great difficulties of this time is what a lot of us know how to do is open our doors. And often we are the site where the community gathers and the community figures it out together. We don't have the solutions. And there's nowhere where people are gathering in quite that way right now, which is terrifying to me, because that's how we come together and we solve our problems is kind of the model. But I think a little bit to what Rabbi Miriam said and to what Pastor Mike has said, some of the opportunity in this moment and the way that St. Paul's just happened to be in a particular spot is that for some, there are different roles for different kinds of institutions. And I think for many institutions where there's been a lot of loss, the role is just to hold an unbearable amount of grief. And that's what can happen, or it's to make the parts happen that are coming to you. And for us at Trinity, we don't know why, but we've had very little loss, and we have a very, very diverse community from all over the city of New York and parts of New Jersey. And within that community of all kinds of experience, so far there's been very little loss, but there has been some. And so we've put a lot of our time and energy, one in caring for each other and being attentive, but the other in kind of working with these focuses that we've had in our grants and mission investing. As one of my colleagues said this morning, no, there's not one homeless person in the city of London today, and because they've opened up their hotels and they're housing people, right? And here in New York as well, we've opened up hotels. They're not great hotels, but we are housing people. We haven't housed everyone. We can't make the same claim, which is why I use the quote. But what we know is that we can. We've got enough money to do it. We've got enough resources to do it. We have enough buildings to do it. All we need is the political will and organization to get it done. So we're building a plan towards it, which we had planned to do in a slower, more a slower way. It would have taken longer to get there. We're going to get there faster, and we're going to get there with some larger solutions earlier on, and we're partnering with other philanthropy to do that. I agree with what others have said. This is the role of government. This is what government should be doing. But if government isn't going to do it, we can't wait. We can't let people die while we wait for there to be better government. So that's one place where I feel very much we're doing exactly what we did when we opened St. Paul's. We're stepping into a breach. And then the other one is there is opportunity in this moment around significantly shifting how this country thinks about incarceration and shining a really, really bright light on how many people are held in inhumane conditions in parts of New York in dungeons, essentially, where you cannot there's no way that you can isolate in the way that you should. There isn't proper medical care. Someone's being held for 45 days or 90 days in what is now a death sentence, potentially, because the arbitrariness just the obscenity of how the incarceral system is organized, what it actually is, who is held, is revealed to anyone that wants to pay attention right now. And so we are working with all of our grants partners in that area and our program partners and with Central Synagogue, our interfaith partners, to push our mayor and governor to not lose sight of this critical moment where people literally, so what we've asked them to do is, if someone's got less than a year on their sentence, 90 days, if they're over 50, like, what are we doing? They will die in there. And it's interesting to me that in this moment of so much opportunity for leadership, when it takes so much leadership to convince New Yorkers to stay inside, that this risk hasn't been taken by we're in a very progressive state, frankly. We're not getting a lot of support yet, or the support that we should get, but it is a moment, right? It's a moment to shine a light on what has happened, and ideally a moment that a lot of people are freed that shouldn't be held.
And how do you, I mean, that's just, it's incredible work. And, you know, thinking about your point of how, you know, often the community is able to physically come together to find its ministry, or the ministry comes in the door. You know, we're seeing the ministry come in the door in different ways now. It doesn't look the same way, but it's coming in. And, you know, that's something, Pastor Mike, the work that you all are doing with Masks for the People is, you know, that's a ministry coming to the door and knocking and you're meeting it and you're answering it. You know, similarly with incarceration, you know, as we think about this and the ways in which we are responding, faith institutions and other civic institutions, and in some places governments, are responding in this incredibly human way to these incredibly human needs. What's the potential for sustaining that over the longer term? How do we turn that instinct in the moment of crisis into something that says, let's not have any more homeless people, even when there isn't a pandemic, or let's not have any more people in prison or jail for entirely inappropriate reasons, even when there isn't a pandemic? You know, what does it look like to try to sustain that and to move this into a future that looks really different from where we were before?
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly say, you know, the task for us is to use many different strategies at the same time. Maybe the same person or people or faith leader doesn't have to do many different things at one time, because we are human and we have limitations, thankfully. But the coordination of our faith engagement, our faith activism, our faithfulness, if you will, must be at an all-time high. I think it's just always important for us to keep reminding ourselves that charity, philanthropy, and even the radical generosity of our faith institutions cannot replace government. And to the extent that we let the government off the hook at the local, state, and federal level of caring for our citizenry, then we are not being as faithful as we need to be as well. And so we train our clergy across the country to think of certainly mercy ministries and justice ministries and community development ministries as a multi-faceted approach that has to be done in the short term and the long term. We have to, as faith leaders, use proclamation, the spoken word, the bold prophetic use of our faith traditions, both sacred texts and admonitions, to call out wickedness. And we have an abundance of systemic wickedness on display right now, and it is filtering down, emboldening right-wing racists to literally hunt Black folks. Rabbi was talking about the rise of anti-Semitism. We already know that immigrants and undocumented and our Asian loved ones and folks who just aren't white, right? We know that this is happening right now on our watch, and all of us have to speak out against it very loudly. We have to like sound the alarm. We have to have a zero tolerance for this kind of behavior, even if it's among our family members in our congregations. We have to use our proclamations, our voices, to call it out. We have to take seriously policy initiatives and figure out how do we bring the whole of our traditions into a policy advocacy framework. If it's nothing but calling our elected officials, if it's nothing but sending letters and emails at the local, state, and federal level. I know at the federal level, it's been heartening to see Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders and others working together to propose a $2,000 per month basic income proposal for the length of this COVID virus crisis we're in. That is a radical proposal that all of us should be amplifying. The Essential Workers Bill of Rights that Senator Warren and Ro Khanna Representative Rokana have put up. We should be amplifying those proposals. So we can't forget a policy framework. We do the programmatic stuff very well. That is our mercy ministry efforts. We have to keep that going. But I just want to implore all of us who are listening, this moment requires a multifaceted approach. And while our loved ones are sheltering in place, looking for ways to be responsive, looking for ways to be a part of the solution, how do we plug into those efforts that may not have our branding, may not have our faith institution's name on it, may not even be people we agree with on other issues, but on this moment we agree we need basic proclamation, basic policies that preserve life, and we can keep arguing about the other things after we all can go back outside and play without fear of not having what we need to be protected to the extent that we as human beings living in this kind of very precarious world can be. That's a really important part, I think, of our response in the short and long term as well.
Yeah, that's so compelling, the different tracks, as you said, and the ways in which we have to all think through operating at a number of different levels, personally and spiritually and community-wide. Miriam or Winnie, do either of you all want to add anything to that? Just thinking about sort of where we go from here into the longer term.
I'll add something. I mean, mindful of the fact that there are people that are completely disconnected from our online. So yeah, that there are people that are just really cut off right now. So mindful of that, and that's very much an income and services issue. My experience at Trinity, I think, is similar. Our experience to the rest of the country, and that we're hearing from our communities how much they're taking in because they're at home, how much of this kind of thing they're watching, and it is a fundamental role of the faith community, I think, to interpret for people. We translate all the time, right? How does your faith act out into the world? And right now, a lot of people who aren't that religious but are affiliated with some faith are watching a lot of us across boundaries because they can. And in this moment, why a universal basic income makes sense all of a sudden makes sense. It didn't make as much sense for a lot of people 6 months ago, but why that would have to be in your pocket when you're in your apartment and lost your job last week makes sense in a way that maybe just having someone make some more jobs sounded good enough a couple of months ago. So there are these opportunities right now to teach, to translate, to connect our tradition to the reality of the world around us, and to resist this isolation. The way that we are talked about right now, like the Supreme Court is hearing, can we be allowed to discriminate in hiring in our own institutions? Like that we have somehow been reduced to in what ways can we discriminate as faith communities, as opposed to how are we provoking our nation into becoming the kind of nation that it should be, or we are reduced to a food program when we actually have a much larger role in the public square, and we actually kind of have the space because people are watching us across boundaries in a way that can't happen if they go somewhere on a Friday or a Sunday. So there's a lot of opportunity right now, and I think people are eager for meaning and hope, and we're the people that are in that business.
Yeah. Well, just on that, and we're going to turn to questions from the audience in just a moment here. And so encourage folks to continue to post questions. But, just on that last note, and as many of you have alluded to already, this is a time of incredible fear and grief for everyone in this country, in this world. What are the ways in which faith institutions can provide guidance in these moments of grief? How do we help our communities navigate this trauma that will impact us for many, many, many years to come?
Well, I know that in our context, we've been preaching about lament incessantly. We preach regularly in the last month about theodicy. We believe our spiritual traditions have deep resources that span the complexity of human life, that perhaps in the United States of America, until you personally lose a loved one or experience a loss or a tragedy happens intermittently, we leave these texts often on the shelf. But I do believe we are not the first group of human beings, particularly people of faith in the history of the world, to experience this kind of loss. One could also argue, looking to our non-first world countries across the world, and just seeing how do they live day to day with a vibrant faith or even a precarious faith in light of tragedies that do indeed define their daily existence. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to be in solidarity. Certainly, as a Christian pastor, a follower of Jesus, we often talk about the need for us to be in a posture of sharing in the broken body of Jesus, as 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 we share it through time, not just in this moment or in the world, but through time. That there have been people who have lost their lives because of human negligence or human deviousness, and their faith was not forsaken. And so I do believe we depend on our traditions. It's not a time to lean away from our traditions. It's a time to actually lean into them, excavate the wisdom of those that have come before us, rehearse the practices more than ever, about asking those hard questions to the Creator, knowing that the Creator is gracious and generous enough to sit with us until we get the answers that we need to continue to live day to day with love and generosity and charity in our hearts.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that too, of what is it, inherent loneliness that is suffering as a whole. And for me personally, sometimes it's helpful to be reminded that I'm not alone and the divine is part of me. But sometimes it isn't, because it just feels lonely as part of it, of just living in the mess of everything. And I have found too, like you were saying, Pastor Mike, this idea of generational suffering is continuous, and that we're part of this cycle of it all, and that a culture of slavery into wilderness, and then eventually into promised land, that just becomes wilderness again and slavery again, and all different forms of those things. And something that gives me comfort as part of a faith community is thinking that when Judaism started and it was temple oriented and it was all about sacrificing and putting things on an altar, that version of a Jewish peoplehood doesn't exist anymore. We couldn't find somebody who does that anymore, and we wouldn't recognize that faith. And if you even talk to my grandfather, who's a survivor of the Holocaust, if you talked to him when he was 17 years old in Germany, and during the rise of Nazi Germany, if you had said someday you'll have this blonde granddaughter in the Midwest of Ohio being a rabbi, he would have been like, that's not Judaism, that's not mine. And so too, I think that this moment of suffering and wilderness will give birth to another kind of faith that we really need to bring up alongside us, that we have control in that right now, that perhaps the faith that was serving us before all this isn't work for us anymore. I think for some of us, this is the first experience of the bottom falling out, of national systems failing us. And for others of us, we're like, join the team. We've been doing this for a while. Like, it all broke in the first place. But sort of just like leveling out the awareness of what's happening right now, and then trying not to explain it away, but saying, right now we can't figure it out, but there's going to be a faith that we're going to build during this time that's going to emerge, and it's going to be for our grandchildren. And that there's comfort in that, knowing that's possible without having to try to make the suffering make sense in this moment.
Yeah. Winnie, do you want to add anything before we move to our questions from the audience?
In our community, we've gone back, kind of plumbed the resources of the tradition, because we've lived through plague before. And for Christians, a lot of really interesting writing has come from that time, and we aren't aware that that is the context in which it is written. So Julian of Norwich is an easy one, but there are a number of, there are lots of texts from that time. And so the kind of perspective we've taken is, what do we notice in our own reading and study, and as we go through these weeks together, what do we notice differently in our text, in our community, because we're living through this time? My family is from India, and I asked my dad early on when this started to happen if basically relying on him to tell me that he had been through something like this before. And he said really quickly, yeah, no, never seen anything like this. And he's in his 80s and remembers independence. What he does remember is a nation falling apart, a state falling apart, occupation. That it's not that our faith promises us that there will not be suffering. Our faith actually promises us that there will be, and that we've been here before, and that we have resources for it.
Well, thank you all for sharing those thoughts, and for the deep thinking and the the prayerful support that you're bringing to all of us in this time. We're going to turn now to some of the questions that we've received from the audience, and we'll start with this one that comes from Elliot Williams. Personal question for everyone. Certainly you all have personal political views. How do you keep them separate from your work with your congregants and in your communities? And I'll embellish on that a little just to say, you know, you alluded to this a moment ago, Winnie, the sort of the legal tricks and niceties that go along with institutions of faith and operating in this current moment, but also, you know, in the sort of broader legal setting. How does that come into play? What does that even look like? How do you think about all of that in the context of your work? Who wants to jump in? Miriam, I'll let you start. Yeah.
With that, I feel like so I'm from the West Coast originally, and I felt like even the Republicans in Seattle are Democrats, and now I live in Ohio, and I feel like even the Democrats are Republicans, and it's this completely, you just don't really know what everyone feels, and so I'm blessed with a diverse, politically diverse community in that way. And I will say that I think that I separate things pretty well, and yet we were able to sell our building and move into a completely different vision of our community and lose very few congregants in the process. But after the 2016 election, about 20% of our top donors left within a few days because of the way that I was talking about things and what we were moving into. So as much as we don't use names or we're sort of advocating behind ballot initiatives that seem universal, we try to build power communally and not just top down to do all those right things. It still feels like a charged moment. And who would have thought that, you know, just public safety would be a political issue, and yet here we are. So I'd like to say that I keep things separate and don't do that, but I think that inherently everything that we're doing is political. Faith is political, and so even if it's not binary, it's still political.
Yeah, I see heads nodding. Pastor Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I don't try to keep things separate. You know, I don't think we have the luxury, particularly pastoring a Black church. You know, the Black church has found itself in the 90 percentile across the board, probably since the beginning of this country, falling, you know, on a political side of the spectrum, because politics are tied to literally the ways in which bodies are broken and structured. That broken is structured into our political systems. And so I think that I think it's really important for us to realize the moment that we're in. We need champions. We need political champions of justice, and it does not give people a unaccountable you know, political blank slate. But I certainly think anyone who's unwilling to call out the mendacity and wickedness of the Republican Party, of their policy agenda, of their cheating and disingenuous approaches to governance, just don't appreciate the terrible times that we're in. As well, I think we need to call out the feeble, small-mindedness and corporate, you know, complicity of Democrats as well. And so I am what I call a bipartisan political critic. And I think when wickedness is on display, faith leaders and people of faith have to be formed in ways that call that wickedness out, particularly as it shows up in the principality and powers, as Paul says in some of his letters, the principalities and powers of political parties. We all must, in a two-party system, at least at the federal level, appreciate that our stewardship requires our voting and our political advocacy, but our prophetic voice requires us to teach, train, and form followers of our traditions in ways that do good, love justice, love mercy, love the poor, ensure the safety and the vitality of creation. And so I do believe that we must continue as faith leaders to push this question around political views. I do not want someone attending my church feeling comfortable to take the lives of any other human being on this planet and feel like that is a political question or political, gray area. I think the preservation of life must be paramount. And we must call out Republicans, Democrats, Independents, the Greens, the Libertarians, the man in the moon, if he's got a political party, and make sure that they know that people of faith will not be party to that kind of project. So I hope we keep pushing that conversation, because the rise of Christo-fascism is happening right underneath our noses. And so to every Christian in this country, we cannot be milquetoast on the way politics and faith get fused for the forces of fascism and authoritarianism. We can't be blind to that. And so I hope people are preaching about it every Saturday, Sunday, Friday, until they take your 501c3. Let them shut your church down. At least be shut down because you are preaching about justice and mercy and not about complicity with the empire. And I'll stop preaching. I'm sorry. I got a little long-winded.
Amen.
Amen. Well, let's turn to our next question. Thank you both for that. We have a question now from Patty First, who asks us, Phone Trees work for the short term to ensure people are safe. What are your plans to continue your outreach ministries in the long term? And how might that outreach or those ministries change over the longer term? Winnie, you want to start with that?
Sure. I would assume, like everyone, we're really improvising. So we have folks that we know that need food, and they used to come get it. We get it to them. We have folks that we know that they need money, really. And so we're doing a lot of that direct support of people that we know or that know us, that are reaching out to us. We're going to start to build back some of what we've had before, but frankly, with a lot of caution. We don't want to invite people to come out into the street if they don't have to. We don't want them to come down to Trinity if they don't have to, if it's not the right thing. So we're being really careful, but we are trying to stay as connected as we can. The problem, which is what I assume what the question sort of assumes as well, is the challenge for us is that a lot of the people in the most need aren't connected in all the obvious ways that we know to be connected. So we are also partnering with city agencies and with those that might have a larger reach than we do, or frankly, like how this should work, right? You should go to your local school and get help. And so we're trying to work within the system that exists and not necessarily create something on our site. And that said, everything we do feels completely inadequate.
Rabbi, do you want to add to that? How's it looking for you in the broad ministries that you all?
It's very similar as what when he was talking about. I mean, the inadequacy is real because, I think a lot about this moment, that there's things before this moment where I felt like was choice. So if I didn't want to do a certain liturgy, if I wanted to be creative, if I could be innovative around my faith tradition, it was my choice. And so if I didn't want to sing something or do something, okay, it's fine. Somebody else is keeping up the system the way they wanted. And now it feels like the things that were saving me and preserving me and were valuing me as part of my tradition are being taken from me. So like in the Jewish tradition, when you're mourning, you're in groups of 10. You come together. That prayer counts differently when you're in groups. And so we're being asked to be innovative on one foot while also serving, like this is how we handled lament. Like we are aces at lament. We've got that. But coming out of lament is something that we already just didn't really have a lot of system for. And so we're doing some of the same things Winnie was talking about, but also a lot of small group work. So starting in these little groups of connecting via Zoom, and how do you sort of build strength within those 10 groups, but electronically, and just making sure that as many people, they don't fall through the cracks, but I don't really know. It doesn't feel like I'm going to get everybody. I really worry about that we're going to see long-term mental health effects, in addition to all the other kinds of scarcities that we're seeing for years to come.
Yeah, Pastor Mike, I mean, you were talking about having reached out to survey members of your community and learning more, even in the beginning of this pandemic, about their vulnerability and about their needs. Was that information going to be informing what comes next for your church community as well, or how's that continuing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've literally tried to restructure a lot of our pastoral and staff ministry leaders. Now we have to build a more robust volunteer outreach, if you will. We're now recruiting members of our congregation to be volunteers and helping to not only call folks, but be willing to provide grocery trips we're starting to mail out $25 gift certificate cards to families who need support buying groceries. We're offering more resources to local food serving programs, and with our Mask for the People effort, right now in the other room, we literally have a couple dozen folks packaging masks and sanitizer that will be delivered across the region over the next couple of days, and that's happening in at least a dozen cities across the country. And so I think material needs are going to be really important. Our work can't be esoteric. It has to be concrete and meet the material needs of our folks. And then we have to keep reminding ourselves that people need relational engagement. They need to hear a voice on the phone. They need to do some drive-bys, drive by some loved ones' homes and apartments and just let them know I'm outside and I just want to wave at you. Just go the extra mile to make sure people are seen and people are heard and they're not erased or forgotten or going through their despair alone. And so we're doing all we can, and we're encouraging others to have ideas. Let us know. I think at this point, we need everybody's genius to come to the front and not get caught on the hierarchies of religious or ecclesial leadership. I think God speaks to all of us in ways that can heal the world, and so creating space for that to emerge is really important in this moment and season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're really highlighting the role that each of us has in serving each other and connecting with each other. I want to touch on something that's come up in a few of our questions, and we're going to wrap up here in just a couple minutes, but we've had a few questions that are touching on the really long-term mental health needs that people have. Here's one: the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting economic downturn have negatively affected many people's mental health. How are you managing this in your respective ministries? What does that look like? The mental health, the depth of trauma that folks are dealing with, and without so many of the usual tools and rituals and connections that can help navigate those in other times. It's really extraordinary. So what are you thinking about this in your ministries now and going forward? Winnie, do you want to start us off?
Sure. In Trinity Commons, which is our public space, has been planning to open in March, which is now past, and then in May, which is now. And we'd organized all of that outreach work and service work under in the space of trauma-informed care, which made a lot of sense at the time. And it was a way to kind of be very intentional about who came into that space, who knew that space was for them and the work that would happen there. But now it just seems like it was prophetic as a way to go, because now we all need it. And so in the same way that universal basic income should have been obvious, trauma-informed care is so obvious right now. So in setting up for that work, we are regularly, our staff, congregation, anyone that wants to join within congregation are regularly being brought together. So in New York City, it's a little bit harder to do a drive-by, but our version is endless web conferencing, basically. So there's just all these different configurations of people where you can get together, we can see your face, we can notice if we don't see you, we can ask about each other, just to literally lay eyes on each other as often as possible. And then the other piece that might be a little bit peculiar to us is, because we're supposed to stay in our neighborhoods, we're encouraging people to think about service in their own buildings, and getting help from their neighbors. So if you need help, there might be someone next door. So there's little cards in my building that you can fill out if you're willing to buy groceries or do something that helps. And it's not so much the service, I think, as the connection, that you're not alone. It's not just you and your screen and your phone. I think the truth in New York City is, when we really open up, you get a whole island full of very, very traumatized people. And in the meantime, I think most people are coping, but we're coping and trying to create a lot of resources along the way so that we've got some markers and some connection, and that we're ready when we can do more.
Yeah, that's That's great. And that's just such an incredible example of adapting to the reality on the ground and in real time. Pastor Mike, Rabbi Miriam, do either of y'all want to add to that? Just thinking about this question around mental health and the ways in which our ministries can respond to that.
Well, we've for the last 5 or 6 years launched a mental health model in our congregation. And our congregation is not a large congregation. We're 150 members, about 200 members or so. Our budget is under $500,000 a year. All of us are part-time or bivocational, so we will fall into a medium-sized congregation by far. But we prioritize mental health over, say, music because we found out that many people didn't have access to therapists. And so we've been providing up to 10 free therapy sessions per month with licensed therapists for the last 5 or 6 years. It's kind of, even out to about $60,000-$70,000 that we have budgeted over the last 5 or 6 years just to make sure members in our congregation and their family members can have at least one free mental health therapy session per month. And the blessing about that is after about 2 or 3 months, members of our church find that $50 to $125 investment per month to be what they build into their own budgets, even if they are living check to check, because they realize that it's a blessing and an important part of stewarding your own well-being to have that kind of support. And so we've continued to offer that. And even though a lot of it is being done virtually, we also have small groups that take seriously mental health and somatics and all kind of stuff that Holiness Pentecostals of times past probably would not have tapped into. Yoga, all kind of ways to help people appreciate that, loving the Lord with your heart, your mind, and your soul. Like those are all important action-oriented commands and not passive. And so I do believe that it's really important for us to focus on this and to help. And it's very hard in a very capitalistic, market-driven society, but to help our people reorient themselves to a world not driven by the market, reorient their lives to a world not driven by capital, and to keep, preaching and teaching that we have a higher purpose besides, trying to keep the American capitalistic engine alive, even if that means us trying to call the question with our mortgage companies and our landlords and our bill collectors. Like, what does it mean to call forth the humanity of all of those around us so our mental health is not impacted, by just the weight of having to keep making money in a pandemic, when in reality, we all should be trying to figure out how do we heal and recover and rebuild and restore that which we are seeing as losses and grief in this time. So prayerfully, it helps, but we know we all still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Rabbi Miriam, you want to have the last word on that, and then we'll finish up in just a minute here.
Sure. I think just to heighten some of the things we were just already talking about. The one thing I don't think I realized, even though I should have realized this, was the impact of being in a service industry, of serving people. And so thinking about what does it mean to respond here, that all of us who are on staff here need training to support people and to create those boundaries and connect with people. Now everyone's calling from their cell phone, so there's unlimited access to clergy and staff. And in my case, they're calling at all hours. And when I became a rabbi, I didn't think this was what my life would look like, and I didn't think my home, none of it would look like this. And so, how do we get all of our staff team on the same page? And so we brought in a counselor for all of us as a team. How do you just create healthy teamwork and move forward together and not just solve problems the same way we always did? And I think also I've learned to appreciate the different nuances of where and how this is hard for people struggling with addiction. They can't show up at a meeting, and the meeting is virtual, and you're not out of your house. And then what does it mean to be a young parent in this? So things that we wouldn't think are hard, or we wouldn't have sort of broken down into different tiers, have to be broken down and served in that way. And I'd say that maybe 30% of my job was counseling before all this, and now I'd say it's like 80%. I'm sure that's reflective of many clergy in the space. And then also, like, I mean, maybe I'll do what Pastor Mike is doing and helping subsidize some of this. I love that idea. But right now, how do you refer out to counselors that, can't take on more people either? And so how do you become counselors and supporters of each other, for basic things, and then look out for all the, I think we're going to see a whole crisis here, and how do we look out for that?
Yeah, well, and thank you for centering the mental health needs of the teams of service providers in faith institutions, staff and volunteers who are also being called on in a whole new way and at a whole new level right now. We could have a whole another hour on that for sure. Well, I want to thank you all so much for the time that you've taken today. It's really just been an honor and a privilege to talk with each of you and to hear about the ways in which your ministry is leaping to the forefront in this time. In closing, I'd like to ask each of you to share your hope for what comes from this moment of crisis. When we reconvene this group, maybe not virtually, maybe in person a year from now, or when we talk again a generation from now, what will be different? Where should we be when we reconvene in a year and in many years to come? Pastor Mike, you want to start us off?
Well, I certainly hope that we are reminded that when we make people priorities, we can make the kind of investments we need really, in a week. We literally saw hundreds of billions of dollars just sent out into the economy as a stimulus that largely went to corporate entities. So we know that this is not a money problem. This is really a problem about our priorities and who and what we value. I pray that we see this as a catalyst for reimagining a new world, a new country, a new society, that we never allow science and the knowledges of our disciplines to be politicized in such a way where we're willing to sacrifice lives for the protection of the fragility of egos or agendas from political, religious, or economic interests. And so I just hope that all of us appreciate that we are called to steward creation, to partner with the Almighty in attending to that which is left in our hands. And as Dr. King says, we will be ambulance drivers. We will be riding through all the red lights we can to signal the alarm until we get the help we need to people. And the work is and the success of our work will be defined by our collaboration, not our individuality. And that means across faith as well.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. I see heads nodding. Winnie, you want to go ahead?
So amen to that. And maybe in addition, 70% of Americans that don't vote might want to reconsider that in November. It really matters a lot that we vote all the time that we can. And I hope that we'll be reminded of our interconnectedness, ideally in a positive way, but even negatively, we are all connected one to another. And if we let anyone fall, it is to all of our detriment. And our faith communities, I should say, are so needed and have proven in this moment that we can step up and that people seek us out. I hope we don't lose sight of that. I hope we don't hide after this.
Thank you. Amen to that as well. Rabbi Miriam?
Yes, I'm an amen to both of you. I suppose we're all on the same page in this way. I think that I guess my biggest hope is that we are changed by this moment. My biggest fear is that we won't be, and that we'll go back to the things that always were true, and we won't have learned. And so I guess individually, I hope that each of us learn something big about ourselves as humans, and that we use that learning to raise the wisdom bar in the world, and that works to change everything.
Well, with that, I will say again, amen, and from your mouth to God's ear, or whatever the different phrases might be. Huge thank you to the three of you all, to the many participants who've been listening in and giving us questions and shout outs. We really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to continuing the work and continuing the discussion together over time. Thank you all so, so much. Have a good afternoon.
Great to be with everyone.
Take care, everybody.